last 24 hours has seen Ukrainian forces falling back on at least 3 locations of the front line. What does this mean for Russian aggression? And what can Ukraine do to stabilize the situation? And of course, who is really to blame for this? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So first off, I wanted to break down a couple of changes. One is that Russian forces have advanced near Ivansky. This is a target they've held for a long time, ever since the fall of Bakhmut. You can see Russian forces advancing through this wood line here and into the downtown, or at least the urban core of this town of Ivansky. This is troubling because, as you guys know, Ukrainian armed forces rely on space, open spaces, to conduct their mobile defense, or defense in depth, as it's called. And that relies on forcing Russians to leave covered positions, crossing wide open areas where they're vulnerable to attack. Because once they get a foothold in these villages or these urban areas, it becomes much easier because you don't have to expose yourself for very long to move from house to house or street to street. So you're likely going to see continued creeping Russian advances here in Ivansky. Now, that's not the only location we've seen these problems. The same thing has happened in Severna. And this is also a tremendous problem because, as you can see, here's all this open space in Avdiivka. And even I assumed that Ukrainian forces had prepared positions back here and that Russian forces would struggle to cross this large open area to get to the town of Severna, right? Especially given that 2 Ukrainian brigades are here in the fighting. But instead, we've seen Russian forces advance at a really, really rapid clip. By Russian standards, this is an unbelievably fast clip to advance, crossing 3 major open fields and entering, again, getting a foothold in the town of Severna. And once again, Ukrainians depend on standoff for these fights. They depend on drones and, crucially, artillery, all of which have been in short supply. We're going to, again, talk about the blame game a little bit here in a second, but this is there's also been Russian advances near Orlivka, much more marginal. You can see here just a small advance along this line here. This, it seems like Ukrainian forces still able to hold Russian forces back. The only bright spot is in Pobeda. You can see here where Russian forces initially took the entire village. Ukrainian forces continue to contest it. I actually am surprised to see this. I really sort of assumed that Ukrainian forces had just yielded that village and were planning on conducting a mobile defense on this giant open area here. So the fact that Ukrainian forces are expending their limited manpower to fight Pobeda, it seems kind of ridiculous to me that they would be way better off preparing robust defensive positions along this line here and forcing Russians into a fight in this open ground where they're at their weakest. So again, partially, I think there's some blame to be allocated to guys like Syrskyi, who I think waited too long to withdraw from Avdiivka. There's some blame, again, to choose to fight in Pobeda. That's really preposterous. That's not a location that fighting needs to happen. But here's what I want to point out, right? And so there's plenty of blame to go around outside of Ukraine. And before I break that down, I did want to talk about Strike Gum, right? Strike Gum is, of course, my energy drink alternative. It's chewing gum. It's mint flavored. Tastes great, and most importantly, has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC. It's raised thousands of dollars so far for Ukrainian civilians who've been injured or displaced in the conflict, and I'm actually considering supporting other groups in Ukraine. So if you can think of any groups that you would want me to support where you know it'll go to a very good cause, let me know in the comments. And of course, check us out at strikegum.com. There's been thousands of orders, dozens and dozens of 5-star reviews. It's frankly just a better energy drink alternative for your wallet and, of course, for your health. Trust me, those energy drinks have so much sugar. Okay, so on one hand, who can we blame for this? Well, approximately you could blame Polish farmers. Polish farmers, of course, are protesting the grain prices in Poland, right? Because Polish farmers, of course, are forced to comply with EU environmental regulations, which are very difficult and strenuous and hard to get in compliance with and very expensive. And because the European Union has allowed Ukrainian grain to enter the market, well, Ukrainian grain isn't subject to those same regulations. So grain that should never be sold in the EU is being sold in the European common market, and Polish farmers are trying to remain competitive when they're hamstrung by the EU regulations. So their complaints are valid. And what they've been doing, though, is blockading the routes into Ukraine. And one tractor, this is in Polish, it says, Putin, sort out Brussels and our government. And he's flying a Soviet flag here. So again, farmers are notoriously conservative bunch. But there's apparently been another anti-Ukrainian banner that said, it's the end of our hospitality, you ungrateful SOBs. And one of the things I want to point out is that the influencing domestic politics has been a core element of Putin's strategy in this conflict. And the reason the reason is because Russia, since literally the 1910s, has engaged in this type of political subversion, right? After the communist revolution in Russia, there was a belief that Russia was the bastion, the flag bearer of international communist movements worldwide, and that Russia had a moral mandate to expand communism and strengthen communist movements in other countries, which meant that they began a tremendous campaign of subversion, infiltration, and co-opting local movements. And so they have 100 years of this under their belt. I mean, very few countries engage on any century-long projects. But you can imagine how much better Russia is at this now than they were before, right? So what I suspect happened here, and I'm not alone in this, right? The Polish foreign minister has actually suggested, or at least alluded to, that some members of the protest movement were perhaps being influenced by Russian agents. And he noted, of course, it's great concern that there are anti-Ukrainian slogans praising Putin and his war. And that's from the Polish foreign minister. And I think he's right. Russia has attempted to hamstring the political will of free and open democracies, right? Because these countries have free elections, they have free speech, they have a right to agitate and advocate for different political positions. Russia takes advantage of that through very sophisticated means. And what they often do is take existing causes and either radicalize them, or in the case of these Polish farmers, I believe, make their views more extreme, and then encourage them to blame their problems on a Russian enemy, in this case, Ukraine. Right? Because you have to think, the EU subsidizes all kinds of agricultural workers. The EU subsidizes a ton of it. And so the fact that the EU is unable or unwilling to provide subsidies to these Polish farmers to ensure that the grain prices remain stable, the EU could also buy the grain from Ukraine and then distribute it as aid in other developing countries. Sometimes the European Union literally just buys food and just stores it somewhere, just puts it in a big warehouse as a strategic food storage or something like that. It happens all the time. There's a ton of solutions that the EU could come to. And remember, the EU has a lot of money. They are the size of the United States economically and population-wise. So they can definitely afford some subsidies for Polish farmers. There's lots of solutions, but I believe Russian agents or Russian interests, right, have both galvanized the farmers and then pushed them to take this very specific action, which punishes Ukraine, but it does so in a military, a pro-Russian way directly, right? They could, for example, burn down warehouses with Ukrainian grain. They haven't done so. They could, for example, simply block freight carrying Ukrainian grain. They could block Ukrainian grain from sellers or processors. There's lots and lots of options that they could choose, but they chose the one that facilitates Russian military success, which is blocking the border between Poland and Ukraine. And so, of course, Zelensky's trying to resolve this issue because it is an absolutely imminent, pressing problem, right? And this is, of course, a tremendous issue, but it's only part of the issue, right? There's more. It goes deeper. And it goes deeper to the United States. And this is our treatment of allies, right? And the fact is that I blame most immediately, right, the Republicans in Congress, but more broadly, I blame the entire political class of the United States. And I say that because the U.S., right, U.S. Congress had a bipartisan aid bill in front of them, passed in the Senate, but needed approval in the House. And the Speaker, Mike Johnson, sent the entire House on a 2-week vacation. The timing could not be more perfect. Because remember, these three events have lined up perfectly. Putin's election, where he absolutely positively needs a battlefield victory to buoy himself in his war effort to the Russian public. It lines perfectly with the U.S. stalling this aid and then sending the House home for 2 weeks on a random break. Very strange and suspicious. And the Polish farmers engaging in a blockade. Right? So all of those things, sometimes in life, right? 3 events synchronized in a very surreptitious way. But when all of those events benefit the same individual actor, the preponderance of the evidence says that this is deliberate. Right? So that is why I have such a problem with the U.S. political class, is that they had all these opportunities. They said, hey, we need a joint border bill to fund this. And they negotiated a joint border bill, right? It looked for a brief moment like Washington, D.C. may actually engage in the actual business of governance. The reforms in that bill, as it was put, actually would have made a difference in the border and it would have really overhauled the asylum system that, frankly, a lot of would-be migrants take advantage of. And it would have gotten aid to Ukraine. It would have helped Taiwan. It would have helped many U.S. allies. And instead, of course, that got scuttled by initially the far right of the United States. Again, a legitimate political movement that appears to align itself with Russian interests a lot of the time. And of course, it got scuttled by the American far left, who frankly also sometimes support Russians' interest. But then U.S. Congress threw out another bill. The Senate put out a standalone Ukraine aid package that flew through the Senate with very little opposition, 70-30. And when it came time to put it in front of the House, the Speaker nuked it. The Speaker, who, by the way, in 2018 was indeed found to have taken money from the same Russian-affiliated entity that bankrolled the lifestyle of convicted Russian spy Marina Butinivka. So all that to say, right, it seems like the ability of the American political system to support their allies is just like nil. And that really irks me because we've burned the Kurds, we've betrayed the Afghans, now we've betrayed the Ukrainians. What does it mean to be a U.S. ally? Apparently nothing. But I actually still reserve some of my ire for the EU. Remember, the EU has the same size economy and the same population as the United States. There is zero reason the EU cannot supply dollar for dollar the same things to Ukraine as the United States. Ukraine doesn't want high-tech super weapons, right? They want artillery shells, 155 artillery shells, the same ones that Europe used in the Second World War, guys. There is no technology shift has been needed. And the fact is, the Europeans have talked about and acknowledged that Russia is a meaningful geopolitical threat, but for decades, it was empty talk. They made no increase in their defense spending because they believed the United States would subsidize their national security. And now that they find that the United States interests or ability to support its allies is hindered, the European Union has no actual ability to make its own weapons, to engage in its own foreign policy, to advocate for its own defense. Without the US, the European Union is comically weak. Remember, Russia is one of the poorest countries in the EU, right? And yet, the EU is unable to produce the military might necessary not to stop Russia, not to eject Russia, but to just fight Russia to a stalemate at somebody else's cost. There's no political cost, right? There's no Polish soldiers, there's no German soldiers, there's no Belgian soldiers or French soldiers fighting this war, right? It's Ukrainians. And all they ask for is stuff, consumer goods, right? 155 shells. And the fact is, Europeans are getting what they deserve for a decade of believing that somebody else was going to solve the problem of their national defense, and that they could focus on things like paying out every different program, every handout, every voting group and industry that wants a subsidy and a little extra cash. The European Union is going to throw it at them. So all this to say, right, that there's plenty of blame to go around. And I want to point something out about Congress, who has managed to effectively do nothing, despite coming close to almost engaging in real governance. That one thing they have not missed out on is buying insider stocks. That's right, guys. You can see, while there hasn't been much activity in terms of negotiating legislation, there's been a lot of activity buying and selling, for example, NVIDIA, one of the absolute rocket stocks that has benefited from the CHIPS Act. Remember that CHIPS Act? Congress really timed it brilliantly. They passed an act that said that basically the U.S. can't give its chip technology to China, and Chinese firms cannot import chips to the United States, which means, of course, that the largest chip manufacturer, NVIDIA, who is making these chips for AI applications, which were not publicly known as of a couple months ago, Congress, and especially Nancy Pelosi, made a huge buy right here in October of NVIDIA, knowing that it was the only possible winner of the AI chip craze. And boy, did she print. Look at this, man. The House may be on vacation. You know what? Honestly, if I had made $3 million in a single trade, you know what? I would go on vacation too. I don't know what else to tell you. Would have been nice, though, if she tried to, do her job. But the point is, they are doing their job. They're doing exactly what they got elected to do, which is collect money from the U.S. taxpayer, exploit their position for personal gain, and engage in no governance, support no allies, and weaken America's position in the world. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. Thanks to our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. Please write to your congressman. Tell them to get off their ass and try to do their job. For once, right? We all do our jobs, right? Maybe they should consider just trying to do their jobs as well. That's all I had. See ya.